equity fund?
Yes, so the core proposition is our ability to mobilize private capital, because we believe that DFI alone, donor, they will never have enough resources to address the challenges that we face in the energy space. So we need to mobilize or channel the private capital that sits in Africa in the banking sector. And this is our core value proposition as AGF, because with our guarantee product, with our technical assistance, we have the tools, we have the capacity, the rating, the leverage to channel enough capital from the private sector where it's needed.
Thank you very much. We've unfortunately run out of time. I'll just make a couple of very brief remarks in summary. I mean, as you have heard, there's considerable momentum today in terms of finding new solutions for our institutions to become laboratories, if you like, to search for new ideas of how to finance development. We know that traditional sources of finance are too limited. Overseas development aid is too limited and constrained. So we have to go back to the drawing boards. And the only way to go back to the drawing boards is to find instruments and ways to leverage and to mobilize the institutional investor capital that sits in sovereign wealth funds, that sits in pension funds, that sits in insurance companies. But the traditional sort of methods of doing that have not succeeded, especially on the African continent, where the markets are still perceived to be too risky. And I'd like to just end off by saying two sentences about British international investment. We have been on the continent for many, many decades, and specifically have a unique positioning in terms of deploying equity, the riskiest part of the capital structure, making equity investments in many African countries, because we take this very long-term view and want to contribute to long-term deepening of financial markets, deepening and strengthening of the capital markets, because that's the only way really to have sustainable long-term development. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'll give it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much. Un grand merci à notre modérateur.
Huge thanks to the moderator and the panelists, a very dynamic panel for all the aspects shared with such great precision. We will be continuing our series of discussions on this platform, and we were going to tackle a very significant issue, the future of the sector. We are going to be looking at the necessary transformations to build a prosperous energy future for the continent. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to moderate this session.
Thank you very much. Et donc, ce que je disais, c'est que pour moi.
So, what I was saying was that to moderate the next discussions, I have the pleasure to invite on stage Kapi Osbik, the Commercial Director of Africa Green Co. It's a pioneer organization providing solutions in Africa, and he'll be accompanied by eminent people, Alain Obisse, Africa 50, an investment fund which is catalyzing growth. Then you have Tadesse, is a head of TDI. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome the next panelist on stage, Alama Obisse, Tadesse, and Taxi.
Alors, c'est étrange, mais j'ai l'impression...
It's strange. I have the impression that the members of the panel are not yet ready, so we will wait for them for some minutes. I have seen someone going to look for them, so I will ask you to be patient for some time. Why not discuss with your neighbor what has been said in the previous session, so we will give them some time.
Alors, les membres du panel.
So the members of the panel are making their way. We have received the confirmation. We will just give them some time. I can see the first one. I think that we have the panel as well as the moderator are here. So we have already welcomed you on stage. So I will do it once more. Ladies and gentlemen, Alain Ebobisse, CEO Africa 50, Admasou Tadesse, President and CEO of TDB, and Ms. Kathy Oxby, Chief Commercial Officer of Africa Green Corps. So I will ask you to give them a warm welcome. We have been waiting for them. They are here. Thank you. Please take the floor.
Thank you for staying on for this panel. Firstly, thank you to our generous host, the Republic of Tanzania, as well as, of course, to the AfDB, the World Bank, and the Rockefeller Foundation. I am honoured to be joined on the panel today by Mr. Alain Ebobisse, the CEO of Africa 50, and Mr. Admasou Tadesse, the CEO of the Trade and Development Bank. Both of the institutions, as I'm sure you are fully aware, are very active in the African energy sector with a footprint across the continent. So thank you for joining us today to share your insights on the topic of the future of the African energy business. So I'm Kathy Oxby, the Chief Commercial Officer of Africa Green Co., which may be less familiar to some of you. We are a renewable energy trader within the Southern African Power Pool, headquartered in Zambia, and using the regional integration that we've been focusing on today as a diversifier and mitigant of risk to help attract finance into new generation capacity. So as we've heard already a lot today, around the activities going on in the sector and looking at particularly at the 5 priority pillars of Mission 300, we see strides being made under all of those pillars to some extent. Looking at the Southern African Power Pool has been operating already for 15 years or so. The East African Power Pool and the West African Power Pools are finalising their market rules with a view to launching their own regional competitive markets shortly. On the transmission front, we have initiatives such as the Regional Transmission Infrastructure Financing Facility being promoted by SAP to improve the regional interconnection. And in parallel, a lot of regulatory change underway to facilitate more private sector investment. Now, gentlemen, we've been given a very broad topic to discuss. The sector is rife with opportunity, and there's plenty of space for innovation and a lot already being done. We need to be bold and we need to move fast. We need to avoid reinventing the wheel, and we need to identify the most promising initiatives to scale. What do you see as the key trends that will drive the future of the African energy business? And how are your institutions lined up to take advantage of these opportunities?
Oh, well, do I start?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and of course Tanzania for hosting this important event. In terms of key trends, I think I will start by saying that we will continue to see a huge growth in the demand for electricity on the continent as the population grows and also as we get a bigger middle class, and also because of our industrialization needs on the continent, and not to mention the AI, ICT, huge amount of demand for electricity. So we should expect a significant increase in demand. So we need to fund a number of projects across the value chain, generation, transmission, and distribution. I also see that there will be a higher penetration for renewables in the energy mix. Of course, in Africa, we want a balanced energy mix which has renewable but also gas to provide balancing power. So we see that also, and that actually has a real impact in terms of how do we organize our grid and etc. I see also a lot more investment going into distributed renewable energy because, of course, we need to make sure that this is one of the goals of this event, to have a lot more access to power across the continent. And finally, I would say that I see a lot more investment coming through in terms of transmission, power transmission across the continent, and especially from the private sector side. Us at Africa 50, we started to talk about transmission PPP in Africa for some time now, 4 years. I'm glad to see that my partner, the CEO of KETRACO, John Mativo, is here, because in Kenya, we hope to do the first transmission PPP in the trunk line, the first independent power transmission, and Masu is part of the team that is also working on doing that. So these are some of the trends that I see, but all of those trends will result of significant investment needs that for sure the public sector cannot cover. So we're likely to see a lot more private investment in the power sector, in the energy sector in Africa. And the question will be, how do you make it happen? How do you create those bankable projects that the private sector is ready to finance? How do you mitigate the risk? And we can talk about some of the solutions that we are implementing at Africa 50.
Thank you. Masu.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Very pleased to be here. Alain kicked off by highlighting some of the demand side factors, and he made references not just to the normal demand, but ICT. Inside there you have data centers, all these new developments that are also competing for energy. What has been fascinating to observe is just the way technology has been maturing in the various segments. We've seen it, of course, have huge effects in the renewable sector. Of course, wind has been there for some time, but we see massive adoption of solar, very large scale, utility scale, adoption of massive projects. And we're also seeing continued advancements in areas like geothermal, even nuclear. And so it's quite impressive to see how the technology side of things is opening up opportunities and making affordable solutions much more attractive to sovereigns. So the technology side is there. Of course, these days there's a lot of new thinking around AI-enabled solutions around the efficiency problem, because we've known inefficiencies have been a big challenge in the sector. And so that is also coming into play. And then, of course, the 24/7 type renewable energies that we're seeing, the green the green hydrogen is also opening up a lot of prospects. We're seeing a number of countries move very aggressively into that. There's about 4 or 5 countries in the continent that have really identified that as a very attractive growth area for the future. So I think on the supply side, we're going to continue to see dramatic developments. It's already captivated us. We've seen what's happened. Cost is a very real factor, and I think the supply side issue around gas is going to continue to be hotly debated. I think the base load requirements of the continent will continue to point strongly in the direction of gas, natural gas, and so there we have quite a few discoveries and resources coming online. We are in one of those countries that has those endowments. We've seen what Mozambique has gone through, Namibia as a case in point, Nigeria. And this will also dovetail into the other side of energy, which is clean cooking solutions, which was discussed this morning by the 2 MDB presidents. And so even there, we see very exciting developments where new business models linked to technology is really making alternative, clean home cooking very attractive and feasible. We have received very special purpose funding to actually help accelerate the rollout of distributed renewable energy, mini grids, off grids, and of course, new business models in the clean cooking space. And so it's not just the technology side on the supply side, it's also a very deliberate big push on funding, why we're here, M300. But even before the M300 was announced, we had already been pushing very hard on the DRE side. And we've seen a number of small-scale SME players in the sector take advantage of both the resources, but also the opening up space. I found it quite fascinating that 20 years after the liberalization of the energy sector, this morning we were still talking about trying to get the regulation right, trying to get the policy framework right, and it's fascinating for somebody who's been around this sector for some time. You know, that's something that we were dealing with at the turn of the millennium, right? It's not a new conversation. Reforming infrastructure, reforming energy, unbundling the sector has been, you know, going on for decades. And I really hope that we'll be able to get that institutional innovation to actually come together well. And it's not that we don't know what it takes to get things to happen, but I think this morning President Banga talked about faith and trust. A private sector needs to get to that point of trust, right? It's not just about us saying all the things that should be said. But I think money talks. It's not just you know, the talk. I think we've heard the big numbers being announced today, the huge amounts of development finance together with concessionary financial resources that are being made available. So that gives me confidence that the needle will begin to move.
Thank you. As they say, money's like water, right? It flows where it's easiest. And so if we want it to flow in the directions necessary to achieve the goals of Mission 300, we need to facilitate the path for it. I think you raised some very interesting points there around the demand side and the interplay with regulatory reforms. Because I think there has been a recognition for longer of the role of the private sector on the generation side. But we're starting to see more recognition that, you know, the major consumers, in many cases, are private sector, with the willingness and the appetite to pay for the fuel. And it may not be, therefore, necessary for the utility to sit in the middle. So we're seeing, you know, more countries opening up the sector to allow that private to private. You know, do you see that as a trend in the countries that you're operating in?
Yeah, I think we see different models that countries are implementing. I think we also see a lot more pragmatism from countries to try to find out what works. So whether you have captive power, so selling electricity directly to private customers is allowed in many countries. But I think what we want to see a lot more really is a huge increase in the pipeline of bankable projects that could attract the pools of capitals that is sitting on the sideline looking for ways in which they could be invested and earn a return. And for us, I think there is a big effort that needs to be made in risk mitigation. Those instruments are available, but they are a bit cumbersome to use. So if we could, facilitate the use of risk mitigation to cover some of the risks that the private sector is not very comfortable to take. But I think for me, it's also a huge amount of effort has to be made in increasing the resources for project development. Project development is essentially the kind of resources that are needed to build up the pipeline of bankable projects, putting money at risk early stage to build the pipeline. And this is what we are doing at Africa 50 with a specialized project development vehicle called Africa 50 Project Development. It's a $100 million facility that is investing in early stage project development. But we are also in the process of raising a $400 million fund called ASIA, the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, that we are co-developing with the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, Africa 50, and a number of partners, investing to build up the pipeline. And we have a number of projects. I think I see the Minister of Finance of Madagascar is here. We are helping the country on the 20 megawatt hydro project, Volobe. I see that my sister from Mozambique, Minister of Foreign Affairs, she's here. And we're looking at power transmission, PPP, at the development stage. Of course, I mentioned Kenya. So there is a lot happening, But what we need to do is speed, faster things. Faster, getting things to the final financial close quickly and commercial operations quickly, and then scale. So it's nice to do things here and there. We know how to do it, that's the good news. But the not so good news is that we have to do it faster and then at scale.
Thank you. I doubt there's any disagreement in the room that we need to do things faster and bigger. I guess the question is how. And I think you raised the issue of bankability. And certainly through our experiences, I think one of my favorite phrases is bankability is in the eye of the beholder. There is no set in stone rule as to what constitutes a bankable deal. And we need to work together to find new and innovative ways to address risks and to accelerate the closing of these transactions. Through the process of establishing Green Cap, we often encountered that as we were trying to encourage people to think differently about the way risks are covered and power is procured. We often heard people say, oh yeah, it's a great idea, but it's never going to work. It's too ambitious, it's too big, it's too political. But we carried on, we persevered. And where we are today, I think, is a testament to those who believed. And the Rockefeller Foundation, I have to give a shout out for being our earliest supporter, without whom we wouldn't be here. So with Mission 300, we have such a huge backing from these fantastic institutions. So, for you, are there things, particular things that you see as being, or seem to be insurmountable obstacles at this point in time? But in 5-7 years' time, we'll just accept that they are perfectly normal and acceptable things. What breakthroughs are needed to help achieve the mission?
Next gen, the latest technology,
Would you like to take that one, Admassive?
I don't think I heard very well, so I'm going to start using this. It's got such a high ceiling here, I think it's swallowing up the sound.
I'll take the question. I understood that because I'm closer to you, so I can. Look, you're right. There are a number of things that people are saying is impossible, and then you have to just be creative and persevere, and then, when you get things done, people will follow. Success breeds success. But what seems like impossible at this point, which maybe we try to tackle, is those project development. Project development is hard, it's risky. People spending money on the stage before you have the contract is tough. That's why many of the global investors, global power companies, they're leaving Africa because they don't want to risk as much money on the project development space. But we, at Africa 50 and others, we have to tackle project development. We have to spend money early stage to support companies that have good ideas, that want to test the feasibility. We have to do it. And this is a process that hopefully we can scale up, and we are in the process of scaling up. I also want to say local currency. Local currency is going to be, it is a game changer, okay? Because financing large pieces of infrastructure with foreign currency, it's possible, but the FX risk is too high. So we need to figure out a way to tackle local currency. I think this is something that institutions such as Africa 50 we are doing. We are doing by mobilizing African pension funds. We launched the Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. We brought together 16 African institutional investors to back our first close at $222.8 million, $0.5 million. It's small, but it's a way to start mobilizing African institutional investors alongside global investors. It's important. So these are the kind of things that seem insurmountable, but once we do it, maybe hopefully more people will come to the party.
Thank you. Excellent point on FX there.
Yeah, Kathy, just to top up on what Alain said, I think we do have some very promising wins in our sales, not just dedicated resources that are being made available, but institutional innovations that even Africa 50 itself represents. If you go back to the turn of the millennium, when we were debating these issues in the context of liberalization and PPPs, there was no Africa 50. Today, you have a dedicated institution like them that can actually get involved early stage and take those risks on a patient basis, like he said. And some of us, of course, have also realized that debt funding is important, but it's not enough. And so we have also begun taking quasi-equity positions in projects when there have been sensitivities around gearing and there being inadequate risk capital. So we've done a combination of senior debt and quasi-equity. We've also decided that we need to also expand our toolkit, you know, in some ways learning from what Africa 50 and others have done by having more technical assistance and grant funding to support project developers in the early stage on a patient basis. It's not like it's free money. It'll be returnable grants if the project succeeds and it becomes reimbursable, and we rechannel it to other deserving projects. And so we have a dedicated vehicle now separate from TDB itself. It's called TDF, and we've managed to attract philanthropic partners in addition to the usual suspects who give concessional and grant funding, that is official development assistance related funding. So there's quite a bit of innovation happening even within the MDB world. Mm-hmm. I think even the way this M300 initiative has been launched, I think the term was used this morning, many different hands together dealing with this complex challenge. And there's a lot of us who are actually very much engaged in this. I'm working very closely with the World Bank Group in addition to the African Development Bank and the Africa 50. And I'm not just saying this in terms of just general working together. We're talking about facilities and syndications and clubbing together, but also receiving very significant large-scale funding. I mean, 10 years ago, I couldn't tell you that I was a significant partner of the World Bank Group. Today, the World Bank Group has become a major partner of TDB, and we're working closely to help expand the rollout of new business models. As I mentioned earlier on, DRE, distributed renewable energy, but also mini grids, off grids. And we have clients here in Tanzania who've made good use of some of those facilities. This is long-term funding. We can go 15 years. This is for private sector SME lending, right? So if you go back 5 years ago, none of these facilities existed. So, I mean, there's real practical examples that we can point to that shows that, you know, these big policy pushes are getting dedicated funding. Of course, you know, in the final analysis, you need that risk appetite, right? And I think that countries do need to continue investing in creating an attractive and enabling environment. I think that was spoken about again this morning. Predictability is so important. Even though it's obvious, in reality, it's not simple, right? It's an obvious matter, but we've seen setbacks in a number of cases, and we see you know, dramatic shocks happening in some countries. And so I think we just need to keep beating those particular drums because, you know, that's exactly the kind of thing that scares developers away, right? I've been involved in some countries where there were missing links, and you have a pay or take kind of arrangement. And so the power project that was generating the power did their part. And they're like, you were supposed to roll out the transmission line. You didn't. So it's a deemed take. And so the client had to, the sovereign actually had to pay for the power, even though the power wasn't taken. But that's an example of a sovereign that took up its responsibility the right way and realized that they were going to break the project if they didn't actually pay for the power that was not taken because there was no transmission line. And so, I mean, there's a lot of dependencies as well, and I think this is something that experience points out as being something that requires good policy, good planning, good programming to ensure that big investments don't end up, you know, being exposed to missing links that become very, very costly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I think you were talking there with you about the environment that is needed for this bankability. And I think the private sector is generally good at taking risk if it's able to assess that risk. So you were talking to transparency and predictability and certainty. And those core fundamentals are really the foundations to enable the private sector to play the full role it can play. So we've talked about the unsurmountable but actually surmountable obstacles. There's no such thing as impossible. But we also can't foresee everything that may be around the corner. Are there things, tailwinds or headwinds, that sitting here today, if you had to predict something that we would say in a few years' time, oh, I didn't see that coming?
First of all, I am predicting things that we're working hard to make happen because that's what's going to change the game. I think what we're trying to do to change the game is two things. I think the most important really is to promote very hard and to support a lot more participation of African stakeholders, be it African developers, African investors, African companies, into the African power sector, because we work, of course, we're very happy to work with global institutions, global sponsors, but this continent will be developed, the investment will be driven by African stakeholders, and we need to see a lot more of that. And we're working on that. The Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, we have a special bucket too, which is there to support African developers. We also have a bucket that is supporting others. So we need to see that. And again, we're working hard to try to make sure that what really will change the game is to make sure that you have bankable utilities, off-takers that are able really to provide an off-take without government guarantees. If you have that, huge amount of money will come in. We've seen it in other regions. We will see it in Africa. So for me, we'll see it, and I'm working hard to make it happen.
Thank you.
Well, one or two things come to mind. I spoke about the supply side, technology-driven dynamics, and some of those move much more quickly than you would have expected. I think on the policy side, there are some developments that appear to be in the making that might, liberalize some aspects of the financing for natural gas projects, because it's not been very easy for African countries to be able to raise financing to develop gas. I think Mozambique was lucky, and they're on a roll. Certainly Tanzania is finally catching up. Namibia, for geopolitical reasons, has managed to attract good attention, the same with Senegal and Mauritania. But I think there may be some dynamics in that space where all of a sudden a window opens for a little bit more access to long-term funding and private sector investment in areas like that. The one thing that I've also been observing with curiosity is the number of countries that are embarking on nuclear power development in the continent. There's quite a few countries that have actually signed up for that, and you hear bits and pieces around that. So I think the diversification of the mix will continue. I don't think it's going to always be in the same way we all expected. But I think in the final analysis, it will be a net positive. And I think, eventually the technologies will become so much more interesting on the renewable side that whether you have strong policy incentives or not, we'll still have a massive expansion of renewable energy. And I'm hoping that that will be the case. On the hydrology side of things, we see some big dams being developed in a number of countries. We hope climate change doesn't affect the hydrology too much. But yeah, that's also a very proven segment of reliable long-term baseload power, and we'll see a few more countries doing that. And but I think that's more of the same kind of development. I think it's the newer stuff that's going to be capturing our attention in a few years to come.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and absolutely. I guess the panacea is the single continental energy market. The dream of the African Union, and we see concrete steps towards that, to maximising the efficient use of the abundant energy resources that the continent's endowed with, but using those in the most efficient way to achieve the lowest cost energy for all. So with that, I think our time is up. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. A warm round of applause. Thank you so much to your panelists as well. And so, ladies and gentlemen, from a focus on the future of African energy business, turning inwards now to the question of clean cooking. As I invite my panelists to descend the stage, I know that my next set of speakers is standing by, ready to come and join us onto the stage. Introducing the moderator of the session, and that is Rashid Abdallah, Executive Director at the African Energy Commission, or AFREC. Rashid, let's give Rashid a round of applause. Thank you so much, Rashid, for being here. And joining Rashid is Peter Scott, the CEO of Burn Manufacturing. Peter, welcome. Thank you for being here. Martin Kimani, CEO of MGas, please join us up on stage, gentlemen. And Dr. Richard Muyungi, Special Envoy to the President of the United Republic of Tanzania. Ladies and gentlemen, at this moment, I'm going to yield the floor to Mr. Abdallah to lead the panel discussion. Sir, you have the floor.
Tunao baadhi ya wajumbe wa kamati ya ulinzi na usalama.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think this topic of clean cooking, I keep hearing it from the morning, and this shows the importance of this topic. I heard from Adesina, I heard from Sheila, and I heard in Compact, and it is very obvious that the electricity access is take more attention in all the discussion. But people sometimes forget that, yes, we have 600 million without access to electricity, but we have 1 billion without access to the clean cooking. And I think clean cooking, by number, is need more attention for all of us. And just as the introduction of this discussion, in 2024, AFREC is released one publication on scaling up the clean cooking and to identify the challenge. One of the, we try to move from this 1 billion without the clean cooking Africa. And by very conservative estimation, this poverty in clean cooking costs us like 790 billion per year. This just negative externality from gender equality, climate change, and also health. In this session, we are going to discuss some aspect of the clean cooking, and I'm very happy to have with me Dr. Richard Muyungi, a special envoy to the President of Republic of Tanzania. And also we have Mr. Peter Scott, CEO and founder of Burn Manufacturing. And also we have with me Martin Kimani, CEO of MGas. Without further introduction, I just go directly to the question. Let me start with Mr. Peter Muyungi. We are here in the country that from the president is spearheads the clean cooking. And just recently, Tanzania, they published their clean cooking strategy 2024 to 2034. Just as introduction, Dr. Richard, just try to tell us what's the challenge and the opportunity that you are facing in developing and implementing this strategy, and how the other African country can benefit from your experience in Tanzania.
Thank you very much, Rashid. I'll start with the context. Why we think and why Excellence decided to come up with this strategy. You need to think and understand what lack of clean cooking means to many African countries, and in particular what that was translating into in Tanzania. So when you only have 6.9 of your population with clean cooking, this translates into about 33,000 people dying annually because of the increased use of what we call solid fuels. This translates into deforestation, which is estimated at beyond 400,000 hectares of forest annually, partially contributed for the need of charcoal and firewood. This translates into loss of time for girls, which would have been used economically also for schooling. This translates into loss of biodiversity and land degradation. So it is because of that, Her Excellence saw that it is important to show the leadership on how we need to change the situation. And this is the reason in March last year, we were able to launch the very first national clean cooking strategy. Now, what has that done so far? And what others can learn from us? Because this is the question. One, in order to transform the systems at the national level in terms of clean cooking, the first thing, you need the highest level of political commitment. And this is what we have seen from Her Excellence, because the launch of the strategy was done by herself. And of course, therefore, this translates into actions by all ministers. So what we have learned is that, one, the highest level of political commitment is needed across the continent to be able to put in place a system which can work for others. Secondly, is coordination. Before the strategy, clean cooking was not well coordinated. But now, with the strategy, clean cooking is coordinated under the Prime Minister's office, bringing together all key stakeholders, including the private sector. So this is important. So you have a system in place which is under a single strategy which coordinates all the players. Thirdly, the engagement of the private sector. And this is very important. To address clean cooking in Tanzania would certainly require the engagement of private sector in all fronts. And we have been able, through the clean cooking strategy which we have in place, to engage key players, and some of my colleagues will be speaking about that, to ensure that clean cooking has been able to embrace everyone as a national agenda. Thirdly, it's about education, research, and innovation. We need to put in place innovative systems to ensure that you can address clean cooking based on the innovations which are critical and important for the communities you are addressing. You need to address clean cooking from a better understanding of who are engaged in clean cooking and whom you intend to serve, and their level of engagement, but also their level of understanding as well as their financial levels. This is critically important. And therefore, you can come up with innovations which target the financing approaches, different financing approaches, different systems targeting different community levels, and also being able to ensure that the networks you put in place are able to reach out. And lastly, and which I want also colleagues to learn from us, is also the participation of all partners. So it's not only the private sector in Tanzania, but working with the partners. We are now working with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the EU and all partners to engage in implementing our strategy. So these are the areas, because you have 3 minutes in brief, which we think our colleagues can learn in terms of what we have been able to do, and which we believe by 2034, at least 80% of Tanzanians will move from the current systems they are using to cleaner technologies and innovations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Richard. I think you highlight very important things: political engagement, coordinations, engagement of the private sector, education, financing approach, and partner. I think this very key area, and thank you for that. My next question to the Peter Scott, and I think, as I mentioned, in 2024 we launched this publication. One of the main recommendations we have that we need to develop a basket of solution and baskets of food so that we can have this clean cooking facilitated for member states. So as Bern, they are doing all types of technology now in clean cooking. Tell us actually what you are doing at Bern, and also what some of the factors influencing the adoption of certain technology.
Thanks so much, Rashid. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. This is the most exciting time in the history of clean cooking. I've been doing this for 30 years, and over the last 30 years, myself and my team, we've built the world's most successful and biggest clean cooking company, and that's called Bern. And we design and manufacture all of our products here in Africa. We have about 3,500 employees. We've made over 5 million stoves. So as Rashid was saying, Africa is very diverse. So we don't make just one product. So we make the world's most fuel-efficient wood stove and charcoal stove and ethanol stove and institutional stove and LPG stove that we partner with our friend here, with Martin. So we make a variety of stoves because every country is very different in Africa. So for example, Tanzania is the best market in the whole continent for electric stoves. Whereas in DRC, the grid is not yet developed. And so there we have to bring them the world's most fuel-efficient biomass stoves. So this is, it's a very exciting time, and specifically I want to talk about our new electric stoves. So, people think that electric cooking is too expensive in Africa. We're actually we've rolled out tens of thousands of units of high-tech induction stoves that feature pay-as-you-go technology, IoT monitoring. And so even around this building, we have multiple customers who have switched from, they've gone from charcoal or kerosene or wood or even LPG and are now cooking with electric. So, people think that you need the grid to roll out electric cooking, which is true. But in fact, the reality is that electric cooking is going to be what's going to allow the grid to expand. In places like Kenya, we have actually spent billions of dollars rolling out the grid, but you didn't give them the ability to utilize it. And that's what electric cooking is going to do, is going to actually help the grid grow and expand. Now, interestingly, if I came here a few years ago, I would say, we don't have any money. There's no money in this sector. Now there's lots of money. There's money, and it's all standing by, and it's standing by waiting for governments to approve carbon credit regulation, which will allow carbon finance to flow. So it's a very different place. Before we would say, there's no funding. It's not possible. The funding is there, and what's required is the governments to execute their regulations, which will allow carbon finance to flow and carbon trading to flow. So I would love it to speak to people afterwards, if they're interested, about how we could bring carbon finance, cook stove, and clean cooking project to your country. So we've rolled out this year in Nigeria, in Malawi, in Tanzania, in Ghana. It's all happening, and it's a question of which government will come to the table first to sign up with us to execute this. This last year we've utilized about $80 million of subsidy. Next year we'd like to do $250 million of subsidy. It literally can happen now. Please, let's talk.
Okay, thank you very much.
shule zikifunguliwa hasa katika mkoa wa Dar es Salaam. Haijawahi kutokea. Tukipeleka watoto wetu shule tunakuta eti madarasa na marumaru. Haya ni maajabu ya Mama Samia Suluhu.
Culture of cooking, so we need
Mheshimiwa Rais, tunakupongeza haya kwa dhati kabisa na umeendelea kufanya mambo mengi makubwa katika taifa letu.
And I think one of the main issue on clean cooking is affordability.
Tunakushukuru Mheshimiwa Rais na tunakupongeza. Na nikuahidi kwamba
and I think as you are pioneers
kama makamu mwenyekiti tunakushukuru na tunakusupport na tuko pamoja na wewe.
Really try to summarize us how is doing, how this will help the situation, what's the challenge you are facing, what's the opportunity is there.
Ulitangaza wa machinga kupangwa vizuri kwenye miji.
And good afternoon everyone. I think it's been very well articulated here that we have an African crisis. The crisis is very clear. There are studies that have articulated that very well. Dr. Muyungi just gave us some more statistics about it. We are losing over 900 million people, or we have 900 million people who are exposed to polluting fuels in Africa. This, in perspective, is about 70% of the continent. If that's not a crisis, I don't know what a crisis is. So we are very clear. We are losing lives, 1,400 lives every day in the continent as a result of exposure to these polluting fuels. So the question remains, where is the challenge? And as it's been said here, it's a question of affordability. The reason why most of the households in Africa are preferring to use biomass like charcoal and wood is because they cannot afford the money needed to get the clean cooking accessories. It takes them $50, $70 to onboard yourself as a household into clean cooking. You must agree with me that this is a huge challenge to many households in Africa. And this is why they have been condemned to daily buying charcoal, daily buying firewood, because they cannot raise that cash upfront. We've talked about it, and as MGAS, what we bring to the table is how do we execute, how do we close that gap, how do we enable households to be onboarded into clean cooking. And this is how we came up with the innovation that we use today, which is the use of an IoT-enabled smart meter, which we fix into a 13-kilo cylinder together with a cook stove, install that into a household without upfront payments, but then give the household a chance to pay as they need to cook. It's what we are now calling pay as you cook. So a family with 35 cents dollar can cook 3 meals in a day. We've just mirrored the pattern that they used to have previously, but in this case, just buying dirty fuels that are harmful to their health and damaging to the environment. So with the same amount, actually lower, they can now cook, or they can now cook using LPG. This is where our pay as you cook, pay as you go model is coming in to fix the gap. And the advantage with this model is its scalability. We have been able to onboard in about 3 years 500,000 households between Kenya and Tanzania. That's not a simple task, but it also shows you, to your question, the opportunities that lie when you engage this kind of financing model. 500,000 homes in Kenya, in perspective, is about 3% of the household population. And this is only within 3 years. So, and this is still together with piloting the product and putting the structures in place. So give or take, and with limited funding, we can be able to scale between 1 million and 2 million households between Kenya and Tanzania. So one of the big advantages is ability to scale and scale quickly. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I must submit to you that the crisis we are dealing with is urgent. There is no time. We need to move with speed. This model helps that scale and within a very short time. So obviously, there are challenges because we are talking about putting in assets within the households without requiring for immediate payment first, and you allow your revenues to come in over time. That's one of the big challenges, to invest in the infrastructure, to invest in the technology, but once you overcome that hurdle, you're able to progress. Implementation.
Thank you very much. I think you are very passionate about it. And I think everyone should be passionate about this very innovative one. So I think as the time is ticking and we need to cover all the aspects here, I'm coming back to Dr. Richard, and I know that Tanzania is a champion clean cooking, not only in Tanzania, but also at the regional level and international level. So what's the opportunity of synergy between what is happening in Tanzania here and the region and as the continent and the international? Just briefly so that we can catch you.
I know we don't have much time, but thank you very much again, Rashid. Yes, indeed, Her Excellency Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of Tanzania, she is the champion of clean cooking. You right said, and Tanzania and across Africa and now internationally. It is important to elevate clean cooking at the highest level of politics, and therefore to get a champion to do that. And this is why Her Excellency decided that because of the importance of the issue on the continent, she will take the mantle and champion that. And we have done a lot, and there is a need for that. One, it is important to ensure that there is a champion who can elevate clean cooking in terms of partnerships, ensuring that for the continent to be able to succeed in addressing clean cooking, you need to work together. This is an issue, and you said we have 950 million people that are lacking clean cooking, and it translates a lot into a lot. And there's deforestation, carbon sink loss, biodiversity loss, etc. So the first thing is how you partner with others to ensure that you address this issue. And this is why you heard this morning, and President Alessina said it rightly, that Mission 300 should also include clean cooking as one of the key areas of support. And we need the 300 million by 2030 to ensure that they are part of the 950 million lacking clean cooking, having clean cooking by 2030. This was said this morning. The second area why we need this sort of elevation at the highest leadership is because we need to change policies. You can only change the way we have been doing clean cooking for the past 30 years if there will be structural policy changes at national level and also at the AU level. To see clean cooking as one of the areas which will need reforms, tax reforms at the national level, ensuring that you change the way governments address clean cooking. You need to transform how the system should work from the top level to the local level. And thirdly, you need to bring new partners. He just mentioned about the carbon markets, etc. But we need new partners in terms of innovations, in terms of technologies. There are technologies out there. We need to see what has been happening in Asia. For the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2021, the clean cooking has been increased by 5.8 in Asia. But in Africa, people lacking clean cooking have increased from 517, now we are talking about 950, about 1 billion. That has to change. How do you change that? You need leadership at the continent level, and I hope supporting Her Excellency will be able to achieve what you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard. Quickly, I need to go to Peter. Now you are the biggest African manufacturing for clean cooking solution in the world. In the world also. how you make that, and how this manufacturing is become like a normal norm for each African country. Briefly, we can have like
sure. It's very simple. You know, we build and operate modern manufacturing around the continent, and for local or for national governments that also want us to come and build modern manufacturing in your country, it's very simple. If you sign a letter of authorization that allow for corresponding adjustments for carbon credits, the money will flow. So for example, this year we signed the letter of authorization with Malawi. The next week we signed for $20 million of investment. We're now built the factory, and now we're bringing highly subsidized, best-in-class improved cooking devices to the people of Malawi. So it's that, and we're happy to do that, whether it's in Tanzania or Togo or DRC.
No, thank you very much, because now we need to conclude. Before we go, maybe this is very long topic. Maybe we need more than time. But I need to have Martin one question. Now you have as be as you go. What's the government or the public sector need to support you?
There is a lot of collaboration that is needed between private sector and the public sector. And it has been mentioned here in passing that government will play a very key role in ensuring there is regulatory support. We're talking about removal of some tariffs on the clean cooking accessories. We are talking about subsidies where necessary. We are talking about an enabling, incentivizing environment that will encourage private sector to come in and invest, so that when you're coming in and putting your money in the long term, you can see the benefit. Because like I said, to move households from dirty fuels to clean cooking requires a huge capital outlay. That's not a big deal if you can see the future. And if you can be able then to marshal all the fundings that we have been talking about, you are able to enter without having that fear or risk, and therefore we can together achieve a huge impact in this big topic of clean cooking in the continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, is the time, it is very challenging to cover this very complicated issue in Africa. But what I can take it from here, first of all, we need to have a collaboration. We need to work together, as Dr. Richard said. We need to as a public sector, to play its role, to facilitate the policy, and also to facilitate local manufacturing. I think we need to have a carbon credit as a key, of course, among others. And I think by this, I can conclude this session. It is very challenging to discuss this topic in 25 minutes. But I think we get the general sense of what's the solution and what's the way we all should go. And allow me, or I request the audience to give a round of applause for my panelists. And I think I can conclude the session here. Thank you very much. And,
Many thanks. Merci beaucoup pour ce panel des plus enrichissants.
Thank you for this very enriching panel. It is true that we have one panel after the other, but they don't resemble each other. But I realize the way you're listening, you must be extremely interested in what is being said, and in fact, there is a lot of food for thought. Now, to talk about guarantee of risk, guarantee for risk mitigation, it is a pleasure to welcome these experts, because we only have experts at this meeting who will share with us their expertise and process on this very crucial subject. Therefore, we would like to welcome Mr. Christopher, the Vice President and Chief Financial Risk Legal and Sustainability Officer within the World Bank Group, and he will moderate this session. He's coming onto the stage and accompanied by two other eminent personalities, Mr. Constantine Z, Deputy Group CEO and Group Chief Risk Officer within the Africa Guarantee Fund, and also Mr. Chinua Azubike, who is the CEO of Infracredit. Ladies and gentlemen, you're being asked to come up onto the stage for the next panel session. Thank you.
Sasa tupo katika hatua za kutafuta fedha ili tuanze kuprinti gazeti letu ambalo litakuwa kiunganishi kati yetu na serikali, kati yetu na jamii, na pia sisi wa machinga wenyewe kwa wenyewe, ili tuwe na umoja ulio madhubuti. Mheshimiwa Rais, katika kuhakikisha tunamaliza changamoto ya upatikanaji wa maeneo rafiki ya kufanyia biashara kwa wamachinga, tunapendekeza na kushauri Shirika la Nyumba la Taifa NHC lifanye uwekezaji maalum kwa kufanya mambo yafuatayo.
Bridging the risk divide, scaling private investment with enhanced de-risking solutions. I'm Ethiopia Safara, MEGA Vice President, responsible for finance, risk, legal, and sustainability. I'm pleased to be able to introduce the panelists of today's session. Ms. Vencia Fontonder, Head Renewable Energy, Power and Infrastructure at Standard Bank. Mr. Constant Nzi, who's Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer and Group Chief Risk Officer, African Guarantee Fund. And then we're also joined by Mr. Chinua Azubike, who is CEO of InfraCredit. Private sector participation will be critical to meet the investment needs of Mission 300 in both off-grid and on-grid energy systems. However, scaling private sector investment requires a conducive business climate, as you've heard multiple times today, and increased investor confidence. Through the energy compacts, the governments have signaled their commitment to improving an enabling environment for private sector investment and to take bold steps to build the capacity of the utility and government to put the electricity sector on the pathway to financial sustainability. Over the last year, unprecedented amounts of private capital have been committed to Mission 300, including with strong willingness to support innovative business models in both distributed renewable energy and on-grid space. However, private investors continue to be wary of the range of commercial and non-commercial risks facing energy companies in Africa. So I'm pleased today that this conversation will focus on what guarantee providers can do differently to accelerate private investment in the energy sector. With that, I'm going to turn to the first question that I'm going to address to Mr. Chinua Azubike, the CEO of InfraCredit. And I have a two-part question for you. First, InfraCredit has an impressive record of catalyzing domestic credit from pension funds and from insurance funds into traditional infrastructure projects. How is InfraCredit adapting its approach for DRE, for distributed energy companies? And second, when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned the importance of building an ecosystem to support the efficient financing of distributed energy companies. Tell us more.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. A bit of a context, just in terms of the opportunity we see for domestic financing for DRE and essential infrastructure in Africa. The AFDB estimates that within the assets under management of the pensions, the insurance, and sovereign wealth funds and other asset managers across Africa is estimated at about $2.5 trillion. And this grows as an average rate of between 10 to 15% per annum. Now, the opportunity is mobilizing these domestic resources to finance development. And if you put it within the context of DRE, what InfraCredit has been able to achieve with the support of our development partners is de-risking renewable energy projects to raise long-term finance in local currency from the capital markets and from this class of institutional investors. However, as we think about scale, there are two things we observe. So first is, this is a nascent asset class that requires some level of standardization in terms of how do you ensure the documents, the preparation phase of these projects meet the criteria of lenders. And this is so important that we walk backwards to helping leveraging the sort of tools and requirements that the credit providers want to enhance the capacity of the developers and the operators of these projects to ensure that they develop projects using the right set of documents. And this will significantly reduce the time cycle it takes to get to financial close. So we estimate that this should be able to drop and reduce the time by over 70% if we standardize documentation. But more importantly is recognizing that these models operate within an ecosystem. And so when we think through the development problem, we need to think about the system that needs to also be enhanced. And this is where we look at the actors that need to coordinate from the early stage financing to long-term finance and bringing in enabling instruments that help to ensure that the de-risking is credit enhancing the project from the business model, innovation, to long-term access to finance, and ultimately accessing capital markets on their own basis. This is the ability to rate these asset classes and enable them to raise financing with less guarantees in the future. And we've seen this happen in Nigeria, where we supported a hydro project in 2019 to issue a 15-year local currency bond. And a year and a half later, because the pension funds were comfortable with the performance, they didn't need a guarantee, and that company was able to finance without a guarantee. So this is really a journey to self-reliance, and we think about it in terms of how do we enhance the ecosystem and how do we ensure that the coordination creates a path to self-sustainability.
Thank you, Chinua. Let us now hear from Mr. Constanzi, who's the Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer at the African Guarantee Fund. Constant local currency financing is vital to helping distributed energy companies manage foreign exchange risks and to sustainably scale up their business. African Guarantee Fund is a leader in guarantee solutions for financial institutions. How is the Africa Guarantee Fund deploying its guarantees and technical assistance resources to unlock local currency finance?
Wastahiki meya wa jiji na wengine wa manispaa mliopo, wakurugenzi wa halmashauri zetu mliopo.
I will start with the point made by my CEO earlier about the asset available in Africa, because what we are trying to do is to see how we can make all this financing available in Africa to SMEs. So this is the reason why we are talking about de-risking, because today banks have trillions of resources sitting in the balance sheet, and these resources need to be allocated to projects that they think have a lesser risk than another project. So the main goal of African Guarantee Fund is to enhance the credit worthiness of SMEs. So the very first point is how we help banks to take an exposure on SMEs without taking the perceived high risk of the SME. So we provide this credit enhancement to banks to increase their appetite. When we do that, there is a second point coming in the picture, which is the collateral. Because even if a project is bankable, a very good risk, it still needs some collateral. And collateral has a cost. Because most of the point that banks or end users use to make to the guarantee use is the cost of the guarantee. But what we need to keep in mind is even when you provide a collateral, this collateral has a cost. If you provide a cash collateral, you have an arbitration between placing this cash collateral in fixed deposits, earning in local currency 4%, 5%, or using it as a collateral. So by having a guarantee which will cost you 1%, 2%, 3%, you are saving this cost of collateral. So this is the second thing that we are providing to make sure that the resources are being routed to the SMEs. And then something very important that, because we are talking about DRE, something very important that needs to be put on the table is the tracking, the accountability of green projects, because GFIs will always push to have some exposure in green fields for SMEs, but what we tend to forget when it comes to SMEs is this KPI tracking. And the SMEs don't have the know-how to track the KPIs when it comes to green projects. So what AGF is doing differently on this specific challenge is is to work on some technical assistance to have an expert, a technical expert outside the PFI and outside the SME to track these indicators and demonstrate that the financing which is being sent to SMEs is really helping to achieve the goal. So this is the main thing that we have been working on internally in terms of technical assistance, which is very important to give a kind of assurance to the GFIs, to all the donors, that your resources that you are routing to the greenfield is being used properly.
Thank you, Constance. Now I'd like to hear from Rencha Fontonder, who is, as I said, head of renewable energy and power and infrastructure at Standard Bank. Rencha, as Africa's largest bank, Standard Bank is an important leader in financing energy access and the energy transition. What is Standard Bank doing differently to expand financing, and what would you like to see more of from guarantee providers?
Thanks.
Lakini uongozi wa machinga na masoko utakaa kitako kuona sababu ni zipi na tuweze kuzichukulia hatua mioto ile isitokee. Lakini niwape pole sana kwa hayo yanayotokea. Serikali iko pamoja nanyi katika hilo.
Can you hear me now? Perfect.
Niwashukuru pia kama nilivyosema mapema.
Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. I think it's an important question, and maybe just for clarity, many of you may not know Standard Bank per se, but we also operate in some countries as Stand Big Bank, like in Tanzania. So for us, it's more about a partnership opportunity. Our clients range from smaller scale clients in the SME sector up to large scale projects, and we focus mostly at the moment in Africa around energy access, linking that to larger scale projects. When we look at the different type of opportunities, and this is where commercial banks are to a certain extent critical, but also important to partner with DFIs and guarantee providers. I believe that you can leverage what we can do as a commercial bank 3, 4, 5 times if you find the right balance in terms of the type of guarantees and the need that is out there. We look at, for example, when you look at solar home systems versus mini-grids versus IPPs selling into utilities versus what we see now being developed in the continent, traders, aggregation, the need for the type of finance and the risk allocation very different. So, for example, when you look at the solar home system, we've done some of these portfolio plays, specifically in Kenya, and our role was very limited to local currency finance in country through the balance sheet that we do have available, supporting the DFIs at that point in time. However, it hasn't been that significant in terms of scaling up the rollout and financing of that play. And I think that's where we need to work smartly. When you look at mini-grids, we haven't done much. And I think part of the challenge really is around how do you address payment risk? How do you address the ability where you don't have a cornerstone off-taker and find that commercial bankability around that? I don't want to discuss too much around IPPs because I think the ones that has been very successful, there has been really good support from the risk providers and guarantee partnerships between banks like ourselves. And I think what we need to do there is probably find that balance between how do we get more bankable projects into that pipeline, because there's so many opportunities. We find that sometimes it's a stop-start and you end up trying to address a risk that a developer or a sponsor should take that a commercial bank shouldn't take. The one part that I do see where we see more and more development, and maybe it's as we see a liberalised market being adopted through an open market system in the markets we operate, with South Africa, Namibia, Zambia and Kenya being the leaders, is where we introduce traders. And I think a good example is how do we find the right risk allocation and be able to fund that with the right partners. We've recently closed a transaction in Zambia with Africa Green Co, and we didn't have any risk mitigation in terms of a guarantee structure, but we had the ability to finance that to be able to fast track the business case around something like a trader. What we've also done, and we're busy with some of those transactions in South Africa, is where we have the introduction of traders, and the need is very different. You need a first loss, you need a liquidity buffer, you need risk mitigation through a whole different range of risk parameters. And I think what I would like to see more of is closer alignment in terms of those specific needs and how do we address those risks.
Thank you, Rensha. And I have to say, the insights you're sharing of the role that guarantees play in mobilizing private investment resonate with me from a MIGA perspective. You may know, and many of you may know, that President Banga called for the creation of a World Bank Group platform that brings together all of the guarantee products and guarantee experts within the World Bank Group under one umbrella. The purpose of which was two or threefold. One, just to make it simpler to navigate the system, the World Bank Group system, so you had one-stop shop for all guarantees. You would know where to go, and you would be coming to MIGA. But also to streamline the execution and diligence process and to make it more or less uniform across the World Bank Group, irrespective of whether or not it's a bank guarantee, an IFC guarantee, or a MIGA guarantee, the three institutions that fall under the MIGA umbrella. But for me, I think the most important aspect of this guarantee platform is our ability now to bring various guarantee products together, right? So we'd done it in the past, it was much more ad hoc, but now we can bring our non-commercial risk guarantees together with credit risk guarantees in support of a project and do that systematically. And I think what we'll find is that we're able to grow the pie of projects that we do by virtue of that combination. But also bringing the experts under one roof allows us to start thinking about innovation, right? So we're now in the throes of thinking through providing a portfolio cover. You know, many of you know that MIGA historically provides its cover on a project-by-project basis, and we've been very good at that and very successful at that. We've had a number of investors come to say to us, listen, I have a portfolio of projects. Can you provide a cover for that entire portfolio? And if you do, that will help me do more. So we're thinking, you know, do we know how to identify the risk, manage that risk, price that risk, and we think we will be able to do that in relatively short order. And then, of course, we're also thinking about the application of liquidity solutions and payment guarantees and approaches to mitigate what we've seen in many projects, which is the regulatory uncertainty, what that results in terms of liquidity. And then we have the benefit of blending. We have the IDA PSW, so the private sector window under IDA, which we use to actually manage the cost of our guarantees. But we also have a couple of trust funds, one supported by the Japanese and Norwegians for renewable energy that we use to actually bring down the price of our guarantees. And then finally, we also have a trust fund to help with the technical assistance around much of what needs to be managed in a project around environmental and social issues and integrity issues. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to do one more round of questions to hear from each of you what you think the biggest challenge is in scaling financing towards energy access and how you plan to address that challenge from your perspective. And maybe this time around we'll go in the other order and we'll start with you, Rensha.
Thanks. I think it has been said quite a lot today, and I want to emphasize it again. If we got clear policies accepted and adopted with a commitment from governments to be able to fast-track that and execute, we will have more bankable projects and more appetite to fund. And I think we as lenders are certainly key to be able to address that, and we're keen to do that.
Thank you. Chinua?
Yeah, so, you know, when we take an asset class like the DRE, which is estimated to be a pathway to electrifying most Africans that are unserved today, what we find is that we need to understand bankability from resource standpoint in terms of, you know, working backwards to understanding what lenders want, but also knowledge exchange and building capacity to ensure that those are built, integrated into as tools into how projects are prepared. And I think that knowledge exchange can be replicated and expanded So you don't have to essentially go through the same whole cycle that it will take. For example, in Nigeria, if we've proven that you could standardize through these models and enable aggregation and scale. And this is what we're doing, at InfraCredit, sort of using these tools to develop standards and processes that can help the development cycle of projects to come in a form that lenders are willing to support. And I believe that through this approach, we can leverage the other support system that could come from for the technical assistance or for the form of blending, but that we can replicate these solutions across other markets, because it's really the same pain points that developers are struggling with across the continent when it comes to these business model and asset class.
Thank you, Chinua. Constance, you get the last word.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So for me, the main challenge is what you rightly describe within the bank. Because you mentioned that within the bank, what you have been trying to do is to put everything on the same platform and make sure that it is deployed on an optimal manner. So this is a work you have been doing very well within the bank. But from where we are sitting as another player, we think that if we want to be optimal or efficient in deploying these resources to the private sector, we need to have this one team, not within the World Bank or the African Development Bank, but across all players. Make sure that if there is one solution which is already being deployed by one player, this player has to deploy this solution and not start having many players deploying the same solution. We talk about guarantee. We have to identify which is the proper guarantee fund in this sector to deploy this activity. We are talking about technical assistance. We need to find the right player to deploy the technical assistance and so on. And by doing that, we know that we are talking with one voice and will be more optimal to deploy the resources.
Thank you, Constance. So for me, 2 or 3 takeaways from this conversation. One around project preparation and the role that standardization of documents can play when it comes to facilitating project preparation and bankability of projects. Also, another takeaway is the role that guarantees can play in what I call the demonstration effect. So, you support a project with a guarantee, and if that project proves to be successful, it may make the guarantee unnecessary in the future. Indeed, I expect it would. You have players that are then able to access the markets, capital markets, more easily, having demonstrated by virtue of the support we provided them with a guarantee that they're worth the bet. Another takeaway on guarantees as a complement to what I will call asset-based lending, based on what you were saying, Constant, right? Where collateral tends to play a big role in the decisions that banks make and whether or not to lend. With a guarantee, you might be able to actually compensate for the inability to provide collateral, and again, use that as a means of doing lending slightly differently than has been traditionally the case. My final takeaway is the importance of collaboration. We've had a conversation in the back, and you've heard it here. We think it's very important that we grow the pie of development projects and not compete with one another over the existing pie of projects, right? And as Constant was saying, and I think my other colleagues were saying, figuring out what the right division of labor is amongst us, right? Who's best placed to take on a particular aspect of a project and have that entity, organization, take on that role and find a complementary role to play. I think collaboration is going to be far better for growing the pie of development projects as opposed to competition. But with that, if you could give a round of applause to our panelists. And I think we've gained 5 minutes of time. So with that, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can do a better round of applause. I know it is late in the afternoon, but that was a riveting conversation. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I do see that there is a request for a photo. I think that photo has been taken. All is well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. We have just one final rapid panel discussion that is left to go on our program, after which we are going to hear some closing comments from Dr. Kafulila, who of course is the Executive Director for Public-Private Partnerships in the Ministry of Finance here in Tanzania. But before we get there, the final conversation is set to really then zoom in on private sector participation in transmission. Now, I want to do a quick check in the room to see if my panelists are with me. The moderator of the session is Mutale Mukuka. Mr. Mutale Mukuka, let me have are you in the room with us? Thank you very much. He's here. He is the CFO, rather, of the Copperbelt Energy Corporation, CEC. Joining him on stage is Chris Flavin, the acting CEO of Gridworks. Chris, thank you so much for being here. And closing up the panel is John Mativo. John, welcome. And John is the Managing Director and CEO of Ketraco. So I have two gentlemen on stage, and I believe that our third gentleman will be joining us shortly. And he'll be joining us on stage. Thank you very much. So we're all complete. Mr. Mukuka, I'm going to hand over the floor to you. You have the hardest job today with the final panel of the afternoon, but I don't doubt that it's going to be a robust conversation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I guess it's evening now. Good evening, everyone. So,
good evening.
We've got an easy one here. I've got experts to help unpack the topic that we have. I think half the time in the sector, we have a small subsector, which is the transmission segment, which is highly neglected from an investment perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and more often than not, we see that this subsector is often seen to be a public sector-led type investment in there. However, over the last couple of years, a number of initiatives have allowed this subsector to change or transform in its own. So what you see is that whether you're looking at it from a west, east, or SAP perspective, you see that there are regional groupings that are coming up with utilities forming their associations, and that in itself is putting pressure on integration of transmission grids of the respective countries. The second issue is that there is a push for the integration of intermittent supply, which is the renewables, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, and so on. Now, that in itself, again, from a technical perspective, investment perspective, requires a different form of and aggressive investment. But coupled with that, we see a couple of challenges. One of the challenges is that this sector is seen to be public-driven, and therefore, half the time, ourselves, the consumers, see this as a public good and therefore do not want to pay a commensurate tariff that is there. We also have in the respective countries, we have currency mismatch with the borrowing currencies that are there. But we also have not seen a lot of private sector injection of financing. Now, with a target of 300 million people that we need to connect, it means that we need to allow for private sector financing to come in and essentially go alongside the public financing that is there to activate some of these interconnections that are there, with the regional interconnection, as well as the new build. And to have this conversation, I've got Chris and John, who are experts in this field. Chris is the CEO of Gridworks. I've got John. John is the CEO of Ketraco. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Mitali. Okay. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Okay. Sure. So the first person, maybe I'll push it to John. John, what is the role of the private sector in transmission? Do you see the private sector having more of a role now that we need to spend so much money in transmission, in infrastructure, and how do you see it playing out? How can they participate?
Thank you for that. First, let me appreciate the host, Tanzania, for this opportunity, and specifically I want to speak all those my brothers and sisters in TANESCO. In December, we energized the Kenya-Tanzania interconnector, so Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania are connected, actually the same harmonized frequency, so we are interconnected, so that's something to celebrate. But back to your question, mission 300 million, it's a big one. What is the space there? I was just doing quick mathematics, breaking down the work there, then I'll come back to Kenya in terms of opportunities. Basically, the world has 8 billion people, 7 million kilometers of transmission line, 110 kilometers of distribution lines. Use the same ratio with Africa expecting to connect 300 million people. You're basically talking about close to 4 million kilometers of distribution lines that need to be put in place, and almost 250,000 kilometers of transmission. So there's a lot of work to be done. But even if you assume that half the people will be served either using solar, isolated off-grid solutions, or if it's densification of existing transformers, you're basically talking about anything close to 2 million kilometers of distribution and anything like 150 kilometers of transmission. Now, look at those numbers. For those of us who don't know the number of transmission lines in sub-Saharan Africa, that's close to what we have. So there's a lot of work to be done to get the infrastructure that needs to meet this target, and you only have, let me say, 6 years to meet the targets. So let me look at KETRACO's perspective, and I believe most African countries, as the moderator said, transmission infrastructure has been basically the national government borrowing from development partners, then on granting the money to the utility company like KETRACO. We build, the government uses its own resources, taxes, to pay for what is borrowed. Then maybe we get a tariff on operation maintenance. But we have actually seen as KETRACO, if you look at the volume of work that is on top of, in front of me, especially as MD, that model cannot continue to be sustainable. I cannot continue doing all projects through government borrowing only and on granting myself. And that's why we've opened up the space for PPP. KETRACO assumes anything close to 10-15% of our projects, when we do our cost-benefit analysis, can safely be done by private sector, being able to bring projects that can actually bring benefits that can be accrued at the public. In the end, whether there is a tariff increase, but when we look at it in terms of reduction in terms of losses or increasing of consumption, which goes back to increasing sales, there's a benefit at the end. So that's the direction we're going. Private sector coming on board. In Kenya, I believe for Africa to meet these targets, there's no way the model of government borrowing can work alone. It has to be a joint partnership with the private sector. Thank you, moderator.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, John. Coming to you, Chris, you are playing in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. I guess you've seen that some countries have made reforms. Some countries are better today than others. Some regional associations are better than others. Could you just give us some insight as to what you're seeing on the continent? Which countries and which regions are favored today based on where they are? What would you want to see different in those countries that are lagging behind in terms of investment in transmission?
Sure. So, look, first of all, I want to say that I think it's possible to do private sector transmission projects in most countries on the continent. I think there's often a lot of discussion about creating enabling environments and creating transmission regulations and so on and so forth. This is very important work, but most countries on the continent have an Electricity Act and or a PPP Act that are at least permissive of private sector investment. So this can work most places, particularly most countries that have already used private capital in the generation sector, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We have bankable structures, implementation agreements, government support arrangements that work for the generation sector that can also be used for the transmission sector. Now that said, there are clearly countries that have made more progress in this area in the last 4 or 5 years, which is the period of time in which GridWorks has been established. When GridWorks was established in 2019, there were, I think, probably only a couple of countries, maybe 2 or 3 on the continent, who had made a sort of a public policy decision to use private sector capital in the mix to fund transmission. One of them was Uganda, where we're in the process of having a transmission project licensed at the moment at GridWorks. Another was Kenya, where John has been working with the private sector on some projects there which will serve as pilots. We're also seeing some material developments in the SAP region at the moment. GridWorks is working on the Chimura-Nakala project, which is just under 500 kilometres of 400 kV line and associated substations. This is a very material, privately financed project that will reinforce the connection between the central grid in Mozambique and the north. And, I mean, Mutali, the market that you are focused on, Zambia, is a very dynamic market at the moment. There's a lot going on there. And clearly South Africa is planning a programmatic approach to transmission as well, and will try and replicate the benefits of the REAP process there for renewables in the transmission space. So we are seeing a lot of countries really focusing on this. Morocco deserves a mention as well. There's a large HVDC project under development there. And there's a growing trend because, as John said, governments can't continue to carry the cost of developing this sector on their balance sheets. It's a very material cost, and there isn't sufficient headroom to do this any other way. So, look, it's a very dynamic market at the moment, and we think this is going to be a very material growth area. It's certainly something that GridWorks is focusing on at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. I guess going back to you, John, looking at it from a government and utilities perspective, what do you see as being the sort of opportunities and benefits of them introducing private sector financing in the respective countries to fund the transmission infrastructure?
I guess one of the benefits that we just ran with is maybe two main benefits because of time. One of them is definitely the ability for government to run everything else at balance sheet, which I've said. This helps me to meet our targets in terms of transmission master plan, meet all the targets that we're coming to. But I wanted to stress more in terms of the efficiency that private sector needs to bring on board and should be bring on board based on the PPP Act. So basically, whether it's time efficiency, technology efficiency, to be able to ensure that projects, and again, ensure these projects are accrue benefits that can actually be felt by the public faster than it should be. Let me give a good example, whether we talk about the Kenya-Ethiopia line, which, because of various reasons, especially government financing, we finish anything between 4 and 5 years later than expected, than what was the initial EPC timeline. Thinking about if we had private sector who could take the project, and you see how much savings Kenya is getting in terms of, because of buying cheaper power from Ethiopia, we are making actually cost of power in Kenya is cheaper because of that additional benefit that comes into that. So efficiency from private sector, and I'll just pick one example, finishing projects on time. They're supposed to, otherwise they don't get paid for it because it's performance-based payment is one of the best benefits that comes to the whole thing. So helps the government make quick decisions, helps me meet my targets, and again, the efficiency that comes on board. So briefly, I'll say that.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Chris, I guess coming back to you, if we look at the landscape, right, one of the key issues is what sort of models can be used by the private sector to invest their capital in ITP. Now, what do you see as the key challenges as it relates to regulation and some of the financing sort of risks that you see, whether it's the cost of capital, the structuring, the risk allocation, and how can we overcome those based on the models that you've seen operating in the continent?
So I'll go back to how I started my previous answer, that a lot of the thinking on this can be replicated from the IPP sector if we are moving ahead with sort of narrow PPPs, ITPs, IPTs, whatever you want to call them. You have a simple offtake agreement with the utility, and you have some government support arrangements. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel with this. There are risk mitigation tools available already for other forms of infrastructure in Africa, including liquidity support instruments from people like ATIDI, political risk insurance. I see the MEGA team sitting in the room. You know, we've got standard practice in all of these markets on government support arrangements. So the experience of GridWorks so far has been that when we get projects towards financial close, there is no lack of capital that's very interested in financing them. We have long-term debt and long-term equity available for infrastructure projects in Africa. The gap that we see is at the front end. It's project development. It's risk capital to develop projects. Transmission is very capital intensive, but developing transmission projects is very expensive as well. Projects, sort of, you know, $300 or $400 million projects cost $10 to $15 million to develop, and there isn't a lot of suitable funding available to cover that. A lot of the sort of development facilities that are available for the African energy sector at the moment were designed around sort of smaller scale renewables projects, so that they don't really fit larger projects like this. So I think that's the key area, and that's where the development finance community, I think, could focus more resources to unlock more of these projects.
Thank you. I guess we have a few minutes to go. Maybe we can have one question each. And coming back to you, John, maybe you might want to just give a highlight of how we can enhance collaboration between the private sector and public sector. You know, what are the three things that should be taken into account to build stronger partnerships between the governments, the utilities, the regulators, and the private sector who are injecting capital in these projects?
Thank you. I think once a country has developed the right PPP framework, especially the regulations and the Act and all guidelines that are there, then whether it's the Energy Act, for example, in Kenya, but I believe in other places, has a framework in terms of onboarding private sector players to come on board. So the Act, the laws are very clear in terms of how private player comes on board. I think the next thing is to focus in terms of how do we get especially the government side, to have the capacities and the skills that are necessary, and here people have to work together. The other one is to develop documents, because one of the things right now, preparing project agreement with Africa 50, and it's taken longer to develop the whole thing, and if there's a way to have standardized documents, will make things much faster to move forward. Then the whole issue in terms of being able to, because the biggest risk in terms of transmission line, one of them is definitely the issue of right-of-way, the way lives. If we can find a solution in terms of how they can be got early and acquired, even if it's going to be paid through the project later, but at least that ensures that is taken care of. Issues of liquidated payments, liquidated support to ensure there is in the utility companies that especially are collecting money from the consumers, they have enough resources to be able to pay. I know that's one of the debates. I know there is a TD and MEGA we talked about. I think we're still debating in terms of how to have either 2 months worth of payment available, some cash support. So basically seen in terms of how government, private sector and development partners can come and ensure that at least the first set of PPP projects in Africa transmission lines will be made easier to develop as we go forward. Then the other thing is definitely how do we communicate this information to the public? That they're critical factors if it's not well handled. This is something that Africa, most people are still have not absorbed what a private sector player will be doing in transmission infrastructure. So that's something that we can work on, I believe, all of us together, and make it much easier to implement future projects. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick one for you, Chris. Innovation is a key word in anything. How can we be innovative? How can we think outside the box from a financing perspective? And what financial instruments are out there for the investors who are here? What should they look at? Should they just limit themselves to the traditional financing that we see? or are there other instruments that they should be looking at to finance transmission infrastructure? Under 1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes. I'll try and be very quick. I'm not sure if this is innovation because it's probably going back to the tried and tested from other markets. In most places in the world where major grid extensions, major grid projects have happened, in places that have close to 100% access now in Europe and North America, a lot of the heavy lifting was done by governments and then a lot of the time by PPPs, so governments in coordination with the private sector. In Africa at the moment, we seem to be trying these two polar opposite models. You've got the tried and tested public sector financing routes, loans from MDBs, government resources, and then some projects, a small number of projects, they're sort of tossed to the private sector and they say, sort of have at it and see if you can do this without any subsidy. The very obvious way to do this is for the scarce public sector funding that requires government support to be spread around a number of projects to deal with viability gaps in them and then to leverage private finance, so that if there's $100 million available, $200 million, instead of doing one project of concessionary money, instead of doing one project, you use it to deal with a viability gap on 7 or 8 projects that are then funded with the private sector. I think that's the way to do the big heavy lift on the continent. The trick is going to be how you do this with the appropriate governance and the appropriate process from a procurement perspective when you're using this sort of public funding, because there's a risk that it could take a very long time to do these things programmatically.
Thank you, gentlemen. I guess a quick summary there is that we need the private sector financing in transmission. We need, from a government perspective, to ensure that we put in place the right framework from a regulatory perspective. We need to have the right ahead risk allocation between the investors, the government, and the utilities. There is no way that we are going to achieve the 300 million access to electricity if we do not find a way of attracting private sector financing in transmission as well. More importantly, I think we need to ensure that we have reliable transmission networks that will allow for the supply of reliable and efficient power. But we need to be ready to support the transition, energy transition that is there. With that, please allow, you can clap for my experts here. I think they've done a good job. We've got John and Chris. This is the last session, I guess. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll invite there you are. Thank you.
Oui, je suis là également pour vous remercier d'avoir.
I would like to thank you for sharing your views during this panel. It is now time to conclude our day, and to do that, we have the honor to get Dr. David Kafula, the Executive Director of PPPs, Ministry of Finance and Republic of Tanzania. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, to our panelists and our moderator.
Good evening. Yes, distinguished panelists, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it is my pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to address this very strategic conference after having almost all the sessions for today. Mine is just to summarize and, of course, to put things together according to what we have been discussing, either from the perspective of panelists, but also from the general observation. As an executive director for public-private partnership, I have something to share. First of all, the Mission 300 is not just and it should not be just a goal, but it has to be something to have in action. But again, this kind of ambitious projection of creating access to electricity for more than around 300 million people, it needs very strategic interventions. But from the perspective of panelists, you can all agree that achieving this ambitious goal takes more than government alone to strategize and achieve. So it is from that perspective that the panelists who have been discussing issues around power transmission line by using private sector have concluded that it is inevitable. I mean, private sector engagement is inevitable, that we must engage private sector to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal and making this dream sustainable, practical, and achievable. This can be noted from the numbers and the size of our economies as a continent. For instance, to date, according to IMF data, the ratio of debt to GDP for Tanzania is around 47%. For Kenya is around 70%. Rwanda 71%. Malawi is around 84%. The whole continent of Africa is subjected to debt distress. The ratio of the GDP of the whole continent to debt to GDP of the whole continent is around 67%. So this calls for more alternative financing to achieve such strategic projects like power transmission. So in a nutshell, we need to align almost every stakeholders, every players in making sure that we mobilize resources to implement such massive investment in power transmission and of course even generation. Because when we are talking access to electricity, we are talking about increasing generation, but also increasing transmission, increasing connectivity. So in order to achieve this ambitious goal, we need to align with all players. And there are multiple players because there are multiple interventions. I mean, resolving issues around power transmission, generation, involve multiple interventions from generation, from project planning to the project execution, from transmission to generation, generation to transmission. So there are multiple players involved. We need government to align with the private sector interests. We need the government and the private sector to align with the lenders' interests. We need the government, lenders, and private sector to align with the civil society interests, because it is the role of civil society to make sure that the general society in Africa achieve equity and inclusive energy access. So we need connectivity to around 300 million people, but this connectivity must go together with inclusiveness. So we need to make sure that we strategize in a way that all the players, from financials, civil society, private sector, all are aligned to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal. Because one of the critical challenges that we are facing is misalignment among the key players. So in doing so, we need to undertake some major reforms in making sure that the policy and legal and regulatory frameworks are in line with the interest of those key and major players. In Tanzania, for instance, we amended our law, the PPP Act, in 2023. And the Act now is providing some key elements to make sure that we have the framework which is competitive, to make sure that no investor can fail to decide investing simply because of the weakness in our framework. Our framework provides government guarantees. Our framework provides viability gap funding, that in case maybe the project is not commercially viable but economically is viable, the law provides viability gap funding to support investors. But the law provides room for international arbitrations, which was not there before the amendment. And the law provides establishment of special purpose vehicle for the sake of transparency and accountability. So after having done all these amendments in our legal framework, we have seen the mushrooming of investors' interest to invest in our country, especially in this sector. Why? It's because of the friendly and competitive legal and regulatory framework. The only challenge so far, which we are trying to address, and this has been, and this is in the desk of TANESCO, is an issue of making alignment between the Energy Act, which limits private sector to undertake transmission. So we hope that soon we'll amend the Act to allow private investor to undertake, to be engaged in power transmission. So, ladies and gentlemen, this ambition of 300 million people connected by 2030, it should be not, we must make it not a goal to achieve in 5 years, but we have to put action plan in place to make sure that we achieve systematically, step by step, and each country is assessed according to what we have agreed. Maybe by making this one, we can achieve this ambitious goal in a holistic manner. Because some countries might achieve, while some countries might left behind, which is not the case, which is not the target of this conference. The purpose of this conference is to make sure that as a continent, we grow together. As a continent, we achieve this ambitious goal together. It is practical, it is possible, but it needs strategies, it needs establishment of mechanism to make sure that we get it done in a framework, in the time provided, which is 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists, the way forward is so clear that we need to harmonize the efforts. By harmonization of efforts, it means to harmonize efforts of all actors, all players. We have to harmonize the efforts of lenders, private company, government institutions, utility institutions, of course, the whole government in general. We have to harmonize the civil society efforts. We have to harmonize all the key players' interest and focus to make sure that we achieve the bankable projects. We achieve the projects which can make this continent achieving what we have decided by 2030, which is connecting around 300 million people by 2030. But again, we need to mobilize catalytic funding, because one of the challenges we are facing as a continent is project preparation. But through catalytic fund, we can access funds for project preparations. In PPP, for instance, it is estimated that project cost around 2% of the, preparation cost around 3 to 5% of the project cost. So this means if you are targeting to mobilize, for instance, $9 billion PPP projects like what we are planning as a nation, as Tanzania, it means you need more than 480 million in 5 years to attain such ambitious goal. So, given the pressure in our balance sheet in so many countries, as I've just mentioned for a few, on the ratio of debt to GDP, given the ratio of debt to GDP as a continent which is at more than 67%, it means we need some interventions, especially by achieving funds from either blended financing model or institutional investors or any kind of catalytic funds to make sure that we achieve this strategic goal. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my hope that your stay from the morning to this evening has made a great change in your mind. You are not the way you entered during the morning. Thank you and have a good evening.
A very big thank you to Mr. David Cuss, his closing remarks, and reminds us that the way forward is so clear. Thank you for the reminder that it is going to take coordination and harmonization, strategies, and more importantly, sir, it's going to take action. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we close, allow me just to make a few logistical announcements in relation to our dinner plans this evening. We are going to be invited, and we are all invited to the reception, which starts at 1900 hours. The reception is taking place at this exact same place where we had lunch earlier on today, and that starts from 1900 hours. And then, more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the starting time for tomorrow. Now, remembering that tomorrow we have our heads of state in presence, and as a result, access and security is going to be a lot tighter and a lot more robust. And so we're inviting all our delegates to firstly make sure that you are seated by 8 a.m. at the very latest. We will be serving coffee and enabling networking from as early as 6:30. So you can come from as early as 6:30, but by 8 a.m. we request that everybody is seated so that we might receive our heads of state. Anybody who tries to access this venue after 8 will unfortunately not make it in. And so we want to make sure that everybody gets this message so that they can be a part of our conversations tomorrow. The final thing that I'm going to say before I hand over to Marie-Angèle, where she's going to give us a little flyover over the program tomorrow, is to thank you very much for those who are in the room. Thank you for staying in the room throughout the day, but also for everybody who's joining us online. Thank you for remaining connected with us and being a part of our conversation. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's been an absolute privilege. Marie-Angèle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nozipho. Alors, mesdames et messieurs.
So, ladies and gentlemen, like she has said, I'm going to give you a foretaste of tomorrow's day on energy on Africa. So we will be starting, like she said, with an official closing ceremony. High-level remarks of the heads of states and governments will be there, and other international leaders will be sharing their vision for the energy future in Africa. There will be key panelists that will be addressing this essential theme, and heads of states will also be presenting their commitments, because there will be commitments to ensure universal access to electricity. So the day will also be characterized by the signature of the Dar es Salaam Energy Declaration, and then we have a roadmap to transform these ambitions to concrete results. So brace for a rich, impactful day. Thank you very much for your kind attention, your presence, and see you tomorrow with all the energy that you displayed today. Thank you very much, and I'm sure you are looking forward to this evening's dinner. Thank you very much.
nitaga baby, baby. Usiku na nitaga wabavu. Halafu mwenyewe yeye ndo tamu yangu. Akiamkaga nasema nakupenda. Hawezi kuniacha hata apewe nini. Hawezi amesema ni wa mwisho kunipenda. Hawezi kuniacha hata apewe nini. Hataki kuniacha. From the head to the toe, we're bado ni top notch. Baby girl, kiwa kwako najipata. I'm a city boy, ila we ni master. Kigusa kinita yani tam. From the head to the toe, we're bado ni top notch. Baby girl, kiwa kwako najipata. I'm a city boy, ila we ni master. Kigusa kinita yani tam. Shika moyo, shika roho. Juma blow all the day. Washuone na kugana, na kupenda kama holiday. Kwanza unavyonipea, mambo mazuri, mambo yeah. Kuna level wanna show you, loving you I swear and I dare. Yeah, unawaringia, ringia, kiona wanalia, wanaumia. Usipagawe na madudu, kwani windo baba yao. Okay baby, ringa ni vimbe, we share body. You're one body, me want nobody. You're my body, you're my fantasy, you're my everything, girl. From the head to the toe, we're bado ni top notch. Baby girl, kiwa kwako najipata. I'm a city boy, ila we ni master. Kigusa kinita yani tam. Yeah, top notch. Yeah, yeah. Top notch. Yeah. Top notch. you.